Michael St. Laurent, Senior Consultant here at Widerfunnel, also known as MSL or Missile, or I think you've got a lot of names around here.
Yep.
So we're talking today about a subject that is near and dear to our hearts, which is experimentation velocity. So, Mike, first of all, what can we learn from Henry Ford about experimentation velocity?
Yeah, I think Henry Ford is a really great example because when we think back to the early 1900s when he was starting the company, he was really able to pull away from the competition with the creation of the assembly line. And I think that's a really interesting comparable when we think about Henry was trying to produce cars, and in our world we're trying to produce experiments, and there's actually quite a lot in line with that. And when he's just producing one car, there's a process to do that, but when he suddenly has to produce hundreds or thousands of them, then that same process that he started with no longer makes any sense, and he was able to recognize that at that scale he needed to change the way that his whole system operated. And that specialization and automation was really the way that he was able to do that.
Right, so his innovation wasn't in looking at how to make a better car necessarily, but how to make a better car system that produces cars faster and more reliably. So let's talk about the common reasons that companies get stalled in trying to increase their experiment velocity.
Yeah, so I think one of the reasons why companies get stalled along the way is that they're trying to replicate what's made them successful, creating 1 and creating 10, and then trying to apply that at the scale of 100. When you're working with just 10 experiments per year, then you have a certain number of people that are involved in a certain process that you've built. But getting to the mark of 100 and much higher, there's so many more people that have to be involved. Like, no longer can that be a one-person team or like one manager. You're going to have multiple business units. Those people are going to compete with one another. Like, what if they want to run experiments on the same page at the same time? What if they have competing goals because each of those managers or business units has been incentivized to drive in different directions? And then how are those groups going to share information across their teams? That these are problems that don't exist when you're creating 10.
Right, so the complexity of the system doesn't scale linearly with the velocity of experiments. Exactly,
and much like Henry Ford, at some point you need to zoom out and look at that whole process as a system and evaluate where you might have constraints in that process.
Okay, so what's the difference then between getting to 10 experiments per year versus getting to 100 experiments per year?
There's a few categories. There's certainly the process that needs to be evaluated, because quite simply it's just not going to be the same, that there's going to be more stakeholders that are involved. There's probably at that level like a lot of coordination work that has to be done that just doesn't have to be. Also, the way that the team is structured and the accountability, like making sure that there's the right KPIs and metrics in place to both judge the individuals in the program and the program as a whole, and make sure that everyone is very clear on their responsibilities and who overlaps with what, and where we don't want people to be competing over the same resources a lot of the time. Also, the culture is going to change. That to build 10, you only need to get really one person on board, but to build 100, you're going to have to really inject that into the culture of the company, and that's difficult. And then the skills of the employees are going to have to be different. That you can get by running 10 with maybe one person who knows what they're doing and has the expertise there, but at 100, you're going to have to train multiple people, find people who have the skills to do that, and make sure that education is passed through the company, because no longer can you necessarily keep an eye on every experiment that's going out the door. That you have to have some trust and faith in the people that they're going to execute appropriately. And then lastly is just the technology available that to run more sophisticated experiments you need better tech, simply put, and you can't get by with just maybe like a free testing tool. That maybe you have to invest in something more substantial that has all of the different capabilities that you need to operate at that size.
All right, so what you're touching on then are the 5 components that we've talked about with experiment velocity: the process, accountability, culture, expertise, and technology. And that's particularly important when you go from 10 to 100 because you run into these barriers much more acutely, I guess. All right, so what should someone consider in structuring their experimentation program?
Yeah, so there's a whole lot, and I think before answering that question, we have to briefly describe what are the different structures available. And really, we have three options, and they're not necessarily all distinct from each other. They really exist on a bit of a spectrum. And on one side, there's a fully centralized model, which is really that one team scales to serve an entire company. And that's usually how the centralized model works, is that team does the strategy, they do the wireframes, the design, the development, the analysis, and all they do is interface with a business unit to gather ideas and to feedback results from the experiment. And then on the other side, there's the fully decentralized model, where really every business unit or every part of a company operates completely independently, and they have their own processes, their own experts, their own development resources, and they're really operating on their own. And then in the middle, there's sometimes a hybrid model that's used, where a lot of the production work gets decentralized, like the actual development in the building, but then a lot of the strategic work stays centralized. A centralized model is really great if, like, things to consider are if there's limited talent available for experimentation in your area, that, like, decentralized teams, you're allowing a lot of different groups to experiment on their own. Mm-hmm. And in those cases, you need a lot of people who then know how to experiment, and that can be really hard. There's going to be a number of other factors as well, like you're going to want to consider the culture of the organization. A lot of startups, for example, are going to probably steer towards decentralized models because they have like a fail fast startup style, where it's okay for people to go out and make mistakes, and they're empowered to do that. For perhaps large organizations that are extremely risk adverse, then maybe there's a lot more reason to hire like an expert who's going to keep that in check, and that's a little bit more of a training wheels approach that maybe you can inject that on the side while the team learns how to develop experimentation, and then over time maybe transition to a decentralized model. And
it's as you say, it's a spectrum of centralized to decentralized. So there isn't one best option. It's just what's best for the organization at that particular point in time.
Yeah, exactly. And companies will change, right?
Right.
Most organizations will actually start as centralized, and just by definition, if there's a one-person team, that team is centralized. Right? Mm-hmm. I guess they're both decentralized and centralized at the same time. And as you grow, usually it'll go from one person to 2 to 3, and those people are usually still working together. And so most companies, at least at the 10 experiments per year mark, are going to be in a centralized model, usually.
Okay, great. So we've talked a little bit about some of the models for creating a high-velocity experimentation program. How does Widerfunnel work with these kind of organizations to help them implement and accelerate this program?
For some companies, like if we're going from 0 to 10, then usually it's going to be just, we want to watch you learn how to do this. And so essentially we get involved and we can teach them the basics of how to set up an experiment and so on. And so expertise is really the top focus usually for the very beginning. But then going from 10 to 100, we're going to look back at the packet model, which is the process, accountability, the culture, expertise, and technology, and we're going to want to get involved with the company and evaluate really where they're at. And we'll reference our maturity benchmarks and the research that we've done to see how they stack up compared to their competitors and where they're at in the market. And then from there, we're going to say, okay, you may be a 3 out of 5 in culture, but maybe you're only a 1 out of 5 in process. And then really dive into why that is and compare how that process is operating compared to how we've seen successful models operate. Mm-hmm. With Widerfunnel and our partners, like, we don't need to necessarily own that whole program. We want the company to be successful and help our champion grow that culture from within, so that program can really scale.
Right. So organizations today know they need to create experimentation as a core competency. They just might not know which of these areas they have the biggest gaps in and where they need to improve. So we can help them maybe bypass those problems by doing some outsourcing of certain components and then help develop their program internally so they can constantly increase their velocity.
Yeah, zoom out like Henry Ford and see where are we at and what can we automate and improve next.
Right, great. Well, thanks for your time, Mike. And as always, if we can help at Widerfunnel with any of your experimentation program, your velocity, or just creating better ideas, you can email us at iwant@widerfunnel.com. Until next time, we'll end the next subject. Goodbye.
Thank you.